utility companies in the world, so ENGIE and Rafiki Power, which is backed by E.ON, providing their own microgrid solutions to off-grid communities. And this is great because microgrids provide modern energy needs. But it's coming at a cost. I'm not sure if you would believe it, but both these utilities are charging between $1 and $4 per kilowatt hour to the end users in the countries that they're operating in. That's 40 times the cost of electrification that we pay in Australia. And I don't think it's because these guys are evil, but I think, when you look at the numbers, they're getting a 7-year plus payback on their investment. So, it's simply hard to set up electrification for these small-scale villages. So we looked into this a bit more at Okra over the last 2 years, and we broke it down to one really big problem. And that is that even though batteries and panels have reduced in cost, the overarching hierarchy or the system of setting up these networks remains the same as it was at the start of the decade. And that is that the systems are constrained by the centralized string inverter architecture. So panels and batteries are sized up according to the constraints of the inverter. So let's say the inverter, the smallest regular size is 4 kilowatts. Panels and batteries have to be sized according to that, which is roughly 20 households worth of energy capacity for these developing off-grid households. So the modularity of these inverters is roughly 20 households worth. That's the key point. And so when we look at the costs, these inverters lead to a substantial cost at the top. Then there's your poles and cables that need to be able to distribute the power in the network, the 230 volts of power. Then there's oversizing the network because these inverters aren't completely modular for these off-grid communities, and energy demand for off-grid communities increases really, really fast when they first get connected. And then there's engineering costs to design and size this network to make sure you get it all right. So there are a lot of monetary costs associated with setting up a microgrid. And outside of that, you'll observe and probably notice if you've gone out to these communities that there's operational costs as well. As an engineer, we like to hope that every single site looks like this, where the houses are right next to each other and ready to get connected immediately. But then you get out there and you see something a bit more maybe like this, where the houses are not actually evenly distributed, and there might be pockets of houses. So as a microgrid operator, you decide, maybe I'm just going to connect the houses in the highest density and leave the rest for later, which is a bit sad, but nonetheless, they plan on connecting some houses. Then you go out there and you try to sell them and you say, hey, pay me to get on this network. And then some of those houses say, I'll wait a while. Maybe I'll jump on after my neighbors get on board. So you need to make the decision, do I want to electrify this entire pocket of households, build the infrastructure all around them, when only a few houses there are going to sign up? After that, 2 years later, you can expect that some houses may have opened up small businesses, some have extended their family size, and you've got unexpected, unpredicted demand increasing all over the community. And as a result, what we see more often than not is that the vast majority of villages that these utilities are visiting or doing market studies on are just left in the dark. They're simply not even connected, because the utilities would much rather connect a village that has 1,000 households within a 1 kilometer radius than take the risk with these small villages. So, we took it back to the drawing books a couple of years ago and we were like, something has to be fixed about this model. We've got this, solar panels and batteries, which is so cheap, but how can we not get power out affordably and reliably to these off-grid communities? So we realized, and I'm sure all of you guys here know, that the reason power has always been distributed at AC is because it's easy to boost the voltage to very high voltage and distribute it for hundreds of kilometers with very minimal power loss. But we're looking at villages, right? Villages don't have hundreds of kilometers between them. They've got 20, 50, maybe 100 meters between the houses. And we're looking at panels and batteries, and these can generate power and store power anywhere. So we figured, all right, let's take a different approach. What if we decide to knock off the inverters, right? What if we knock off the poles and cables required to distribute at 230 volts? What if we, let's say we could design a network where supply follows demand, right? But doesn't actually oversize it. And let's say we could do all this with a local distribution channel that didn't need expensive engineers to set up. So theoretically, you'd have a really nice case where it was significantly less expensive to connect these communities. So add a bit of engineering and some small distribution costs, and this is the model that we'd come up with. A distributed network of generation and storage, where you've got batteries and panels located across the community. Now, rather than having to travel from one end to the other, power is actually consumed locally and generated locally, and if there's any excess, it's actually distributed from one house to the next, right? So the travel is way shorter, which means the power loss is actually not that important in a distributed network, so you can dump the inverters, go DC quite safely, and dumping the inverters also increases the modularity of the network, meaning you can pop on houses and add capacity, theoretically, wherever you need to. So, and theoretically also at half the cost of what was done by those big utilities. So how do we actually make this happen in practice? So we developed the Okra Smart Grid Controller. Basically how it works is you install one of these devices on every single house that you want connected. You can start with 2, and then you draw a cable from one house to another, or you can start with 5, right? As soon as you connect 2 houses together with a cable, our software activates and it starts first smart metering, so metering consumption and metering generation at every single house. So that means houses can be charged fairly for their contribution or for their consumption to the grid. Notice, houses can also contribute to the grid in a distributed network. And if they don't pay, they get cut off temporarily. This is all happening in off-grid communities, mind you. The second thing is, our controller distributes any excess power at 50 volts throughout the network. 50 volts means you get next to nothing power loss, which is the limit, or roughly the modularity size for your average AC network. You've got one of these per every single house, so it's 20 times more scalable. Considering roughly 20 houses of consumption is 4 kilowatts of capacity. And the last thing is, we made it plug and play, so we could rely on local distributors to be able to roll this out and not have to rely on expensive engineering. So here's a chart that shows the power loss. I'm not sure if you can read the numbers, but it's looking at the voltage drop in power loss. The green one is distributed network, and the x-axis is the number of houses. The red one is a centralized AC network. And interestingly, you would think that in an AC network, you've got less power loss, but the more houses you add, the further the distance is from generation to load in AC, whereas the more houses you add in a distributed network, the more options there are for pulling power from the mesh through a shorter route. So power loss is actually less in our distributed network. On top of that, we've got some machine learning algorithms which choose and optimize distribution in the network. So let's say there's 3 types of strategies. The first one is machine learning algorithms are trying to predict, are you going to have a full battery? How much consumption are you going to consume today? When is it best for you to distribute power to the network? On the other side of the coin, there's drawing power from the network. So if the algorithms predict that your household is going to run its battery to the ground, it's going to need to consume and pull some power from the network. And the third one is resilient mode. So that's basically, if there's any problems in the network, you can simply disconnect, or it automatically disconnects to ensure that you've still got your standalone supply. So if we look back at the last 3 slides, not only is it theoretically cheaper, not only is there less power loss, but it's actually a more resilient network where households always have access to energy, even if there's a problem with the network when you go distributed. The fourth thing is that every single household, now that it has a smart device, actually has real-time monitoring happening. And we're getting monitoring data at like a 10x improvement compared to smart meters in Australia, right? And this is in off-grid households who never had energy in Cambodia. So this is a real example. The top one, not sure if you guys can tell, I hope you can, but it's meant to be a panel generation curve. And our software was running analytics on the back end, and it determined that this house had the same kind of gap or hole in its generation curve during the first half of the day for multiple days in a row. It picked up that this is probably a shading issue. It notified our distribution partner. Our distribution partner went out and they found that there was a palm tree covering the panel that they'd set up. They showed us a photo actually and told us they're going to cut down the palm tree. And we told them that we're a green company and they should be too, so then they moved the solar panel. But that's an example of the really specific remote monitoring and the benefits that it provides our partners by doing it in a distributed fashion. On top of that, when the network demand gets close to network capacity and the battery state of charges start getting low, we push notifications out to the distributor and we tell them when, where, and how much capacity to add to the modular network, guaranteeing that the households always have reliable access and guaranteeing that the distributor doesn't actually have to do all that much work aside from getting out there and doing what the software tells them. So I'm sure you would have picked up by now, but we operate as a technology company, right? And we believe in empowering local companies who know how to speak the language, who know how to get out to off-grid communities, who know how to make sales, right? To go there and set up their own microgrids using off-the-shelf panels and batteries, our plug-and-play controller, and our software, which lets them know when they need to maintain and what they need to scale and how much. And we think this is a truly scalable model that can achieve electrification much faster around the world. And basically what we say is, you don't actually need to be on G to engineer a microgrid. It shouldn't be that hard, and with distributed, it definitely isn't that hard. And this is a super interesting slide if you take a look. We're looking at Steamaco, PowerHive, Electric Vine, and Leo Energy, which distributes OnG's technology. And compared to all of these microgrids, we're coming out at 1/3 or less of the cost. And this is during our pilot microgrid. Costs are going to come down even further, right? This is pretty huge, and this means that all of the saved costs should theoretically be able to get passed down to off-grid households. Aside from the cost, there's the connectivity. We saw previously that the big utilities are just skipping out on these villages. But when you're relying on local partners who have low-cost distribution, and you've got a technology that actually works standalone and also works in small groups if you need it, you can start electrifying everybody, right? And that's huge because we don't want to leave a generation behind without access to modern energy services. When their energy demands increase, you can add more houses, add more capacity. And then if you want, you can even connect the entire networks together. So we're not the only guys who are working on this technology right now. There's a whole bunch of other ones. SolShare has been mentioned a couple of times this morning, I think by Jeff. They just got $1 million roughly from the UN to develop this a bit further. And the race is on, and it's really exciting because we're pretty sure that distributed energy is really the future, and the more we develop this faster, the faster we have the opportunity of achieving electrification for the 1.2 billion people who are off-grid. So basically, I'll just leave it by saying that distributed energy will allow us to connect everyone in the village, leave no one behind. We can use innovative financing models. Yeah, the distributor can own the network, but houses can also contribute to capacity and buy and sell as prosumers. Hell, someone in Sydney could pay for capacity in the network and then enable households to pay that off using mobile payments. And you can do all of this at half the cost and half the payback as you are from the traditional centralized microgrids. And one other thing, final thing to add to that, I didn't really mention it, but Jeff mentioned in his presentation this morning, but DC appliances are at least twice as efficient as AC appliances for household use, which means they get half the cost for energy, theoretically, and double the utility of it. And so this is just one picture of the first 5 households that we had electrified in our initial microgrid. It's now gone to 35, and we're working on our second one right now, and actually looking to expand out to Philippines and Indonesia. So yeah, that's it for the distributed microgrids. Cheers.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions for Jeff? I have a question. Do you need your controller in every house?
Yeah, every single house.
Every single house.
Well, every single house that needs to be metered for energy consumption, so for every payer, you need to have one controller.
So I'm sure we'll have a lot of applications here, Bong, because we still have about 23,000 features that needs to be electrified. The government declared in 2009 that all of the barangays are electrified already, but The small villages, sub-villages are not. And there's around 24,000 that needs to be. So this could be used for that. So thank you, Osman.
Thanks.